beautiful spring here often. Sometimes we have rain, but the weather gods were smiling on us, and we have a lovely, lovely evening for us today. And I do hope that you will enjoy the rooftop and enjoy the food and enjoy the fellowship and the community building and the connections that we are all here to make this evening. I think many of you may be from DC or DC Bar members, but if you're not, I just want to take a minute or two to tell you a little bit about the DC Bar. We are the largest mandatory bar in the country. We have over 114,000 members. Most of our members live and work in the DC area, but we also have members who live in all 50 states and in over 80 foreign countries and territories. So as you can see, our membership is quite diverse. Many of us have more than one jurisdiction in which we are licensed to practice, and such our interests are wide-ranging and diverse. And so we love partnering with organizations whose cause is dear and means something to us, and making those connections and forging those relationships and keeping those going. And so we hope that we will be able to partner with your section in the future and over the coming years on the very important issues that you discuss. I know you're talking about equity and discrimination, specifically economic equity and discrimination. And as in most major cities around our country, there is a wide diversity in our residents here in DC in terms of their income level and what they can afford and what they can access. The racial gap affects all aspects of life for our residents. It affects their ability to access medical care, their ability to access legal services, housing stability for them, food security, and their educational and job opportunities. The work that you all are doing to end discrimination and the cycle of poverty in this country is so important to our citizens. It's so important to our democracy. We're a society that holds out the rule of law and equal access to justice for everyone. And if we can't deliver on this promise to everyone, then the foundations of our democracy will be shattered to the very core. So we thank you so much for all the important work that you are doing in this area. We look forward to being with you tomorrow. I know my president-elect, Charles Lowry. Charles is going to be at the program tomorrow. We very much hope that we can join together for another program in the future. I want to apologize because I will have to exit stage left after this, and that's because the Chief Judge of our DC Court of Appeals, her portrait is being unveiled today at Howard Law School, which is uptown. So in order to represent the bar and get there on time, unfortunately I will have to leave. But I do hope you all have a wonderful evening. Enjoy our rooftop, enjoy the beautiful spring weather, and the discussion and remarks that we are going to have to come. And with that, I would like to invite Professor Janel Goerge to the podium to introduce our speaker this evening.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight and for participating in the Economic Justice Forum. My name is Janel Goerge. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law, and I have the pleasure of introducing my fabulous colleague, Professor Dorothy Brown, tonight. I first want to thank Juan Thomas, the chair of the Civil Rights and Social Justice section. This was really his passion and idea to really focus us in engaging on issues of economic justice, and I'm really thankful to him for that. I'm looking for my other colleague, Professor Peter Edelman, who I also see who made this happen on Georgetown's campus, and so just want to recognize him and thank him for that as well. He has led the charge not only with teaching law students about poverty law, but running the Law School Center on Poverty and Inequality, where I know that folks work on so many issues that overlap. with what you all are covering at the summit. And I also want to thank Paula Shapiro, who I don't, oh, there she is, who's the director of the section and has done the work in terms of coordinating everything. I also see Ruchika Sharma somewhere, and Ali Kilsgaard, who is recording this right now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So now back to introducing my fabulous colleague and friend. So Professor Dorothy Brown is a Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation and Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. She teaches the fundamentals of income tax, which I know we'll all appreciate, particularly in the next couple of weeks, as well as critical race theory. She has won awards, teaching awards at every law school she has taught at, most recently Emory School of Law, before we were lucky to get her here at Georgetown. She's also the author of 2 case books, one on critical race theory and one on federal income taxation. Most of you are probably aware of her book, The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. In this book, she draws on decades of cross-disciplinary research to show that tax law is not colorblind, as she once believed, but she may tell us a little bit more about that. The book has been named one of the best books of the year by NPR and by Forbes magazine. She has also been selected for the Treasury Department's Advisory Committee on Racial Equity, the first of its kind, actually, committee that will provide advice and recommendations to Secretary Yellen and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo on efforts to advance racial equity in the economy and address acute disparities for communities of color. She has written a lot of commentary, including for the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, The Washington Post, Forbes, and the National Law Journal, and she has testified before Congress, most recently before the House Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness in Growth. Her next book, which I am so excited about, will be on reparations. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Professor Dorothy Brown.
Thank you all for coming. Tax policy is a civil rights issue. I'm going to say that again. Tax policy is a civil rights issue. It is often not thought of as that, but it really is. When actually people hear tax policy, they tend to run out the room. I want those of you in this room to promise never to do that again. Tax policy is a civil rights issue. I came to this issue thinking, or I went into tax law thinking race had nothing to do with it. I got an LLM in tax from NYU. No one ever mentioned race in any of my tax courses, so clearly race had nothing to do with it. And it was why I was drawn to tax law. I grew up in the South Bronx. I experienced racism on the regular, and I wanted to be a lawyer, but I wanted to deal with an area of the law that had absolutely nothing to do with race. I knew which one that was. It was tax law. The only color that mattered was green. Well, fast forward to the early 90s, I'm a law professor, and I'm sitting at my desk, and I come across an article by a mentor, Jerome Culp at Duke, and he wrote an article where he made an argument to all black law professors that we need to incorporate the role of systemic racism in our work, whatever subject that was. Now I'm reading it and I'm like, this got nothing to do with me, but you know, Jerome's really smart, so I'm just gonna read the article, and he's preparing for partnership tax, so I'm good, right? So about 3 pages from the end, it said, how do you know there isn't a race and tax problem if you don't look? What? This really smart man said, how do you know there isn't a race and tax problem if you don't look? I picked up the phone, I said, Jerome, I'm gonna look. He goes, good, go for it. Well, problem number one, where was I gonna look? The IRS and Treasury do not collect or publish statistics on race. So that could have been the beginning of the end of the project. But as I mentioned, I grew up in the South Bronx. You have to be kind of determined to get out of there. Therefore, a little problem with no data didn't stop me. What I did though was, well, first of all, I thought it was a really important inflection point that think of all the government agencies that have race data. and Treasury, one of the biggest one with more money flowing through it than any other, there's no race data. Okay, this is a problem. So what I did was I put my tax lenses onto race scholarship. So I started reading race scholarship, and I came across a statistic, for example, that said married black wives contribute 41% to household income, married white wives contribute 29%. So that anybody else, they would say, yeah, we know black wives work more. But to this tax geek, it was gold. Because I figured out, oh my gosh, there's this thing in the joint return called the marriage penalty. And the marriage penalty hits married couples whereby they pay higher taxes if they're married than if they stayed single, when the spouses earn roughly equal amounts, the 40, 60, 50, 50 split, which actually explained the mystery of my parents' tax returns. So, as a dutiful daughter, right, I'm at NYU, and then I went back to being an investment banker, but I'm living at home, so I'm doing their taxes, and I'm making by myself as an investment banker more than they're making combined. So I should be paying a whole lot more taxes than them, and I'm paying more, but not a whole lot. And theirs is a simple return, I'm not doing anything wrong, but I always came away thinking they're paying too much in taxes. Well, when I finally put two and two together, I realized, oh, my parents are paying a marriage penalty. My mother was a nurse, my father was a plumber, and they made almost identical amounts of income. So they were in the marriage penalty phase. And as one of my friends, my tax professor friend said, Dorothy, if you're gonna look at the marriage penalty, you gotta look at the marriage bonus. The marriage bonus, what marriages get tax cuts when people get married? Those are the marriages where there's one spouse in the paid labor market and one spouse that stays at home. And surprise, surprise, what we see is white married couples are more likely to be in marriage bonus households, and black married couples are more likely to be in marriage penalty households. So that was in my first publication was in 1996, and I will say, when you are a trailblazer, you don't often, or let's put it this way, you sometimes run against the wind. So I'm writing about race and tax in the field of tax law, where just like I thought race had nothing to do with it, so did my peers across the country. So one example is I'm presenting my marriage penalty bonus work, and I'm at a law professor conference, and I presented, and it was well received. And the first comment was, Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes. Okay, this is when I say, welcome to my world. Okay? Welcome to my world. So, I thought that was interesting because one, all blacks are not poor. Okay, if we look at the poverty rates at 22%, okay, I don't need a calculator to know 22% isn't the majority. That's 78%. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the poor pay an enormous amount of taxes in this country. Anyone who says because you're poor you don't pay taxes just doesn't know reality. But really, what our progressive tax system gets wrong is the people who don't pay a lot in taxes are the billionaires. We all want to be Warren Buffett and have his money and pay a really low tax rate. So what I was finding was tax law professors, who really didn't want to engage with the conversation I was having, yet whenever I went out to speak to a general audience, people wanted more. So I decided at some point, I looked at marriage, I looked at home ownership, I looked at employer-provided retirement accounts, I looked at capital gain stock, preferential rate, and every time I looked at another provision, I saw that white Americans are more likely to benefit than black Americans. Every time I looked. And one of our colleagues asked me at dinner a few months ago, Dorothy, what made you stick with it? I knew I was right. Stubborn, relentless, whatever you want to call it, I knew I was right. Every time I looked someplace else, here it was, another racial disparity. So I decided that I wasn't going to talk to tax academics anymore. Look, let me say that. I wasn't going to talk to tax law professors anymore. I was gonna talk to sociologists, historians. They were very welcoming and understood the work and got race in a way that tax law professors, in all honesty, did not. So I decided to write this general trade book called The Whiteness of Wealth. And as a result of that, let me back up 1 second. When I started this quest, I didn't know what I'd find. And then when I started finding it, I said, okay, Jerome was right, I'm onto something. I made a vow that I wanted to change the national conversation on tax policy. That was my modest goal. And I knew you're not gonna do that with law review articles, right? So I've been writing since 1996. Nobody had heard of any of these articles, right? Nobody read them. My mother might have, right? Nobody read them. So I realized I needed a trade press, and I got really lucky with my publisher, Crown Publishing, who had a phenomenal publicist that worked on it, which is why many of you know that I wrote this book called The Whiteness of Wealth, because she got me booked on all these different shows, and I was able to have a conversation, and the national conversation is in fact changing. So I will say this, in January of this year, the Treasury Department published a study of the race and Hispanic ethnicity analysis of the top tax expenditures. Drop the mic, okay? For the first time ever. That's like, okay, we're making a difference. It's starting to turn. And then the other shoe dropped when my work inspired a study on audits. And what the study revealed was Black earned income tax credit taxpayers are 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited than non-Black EITC claimants. Okay, so anybody that says Black support don't pay a lot of taxes, if you're an earned income tax credit taxpayer that's getting audited, you're not getting the credit. You don't get it until the audit is over. So you see with that, and it spilled onto Capitol Hill, because when the then IRS commissioner who was nominated, he's now the IRS commissioner, testified before the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Wyden's referenced the audit study and said, okay, within 60 days of you getting confirmed, I want a report on why this is happening and what you're doing to fix it. And I'm like, Senator Wyden is my hero. Somebody is making the IRS accountable, because for all the time I've been writing about race and tax, the IRS has consistently said, we don't discriminate on the basis of race because we don't publish the data. So their argument to systemic racism that we all know operates, it finds a way, right? Operates whether there's intent or not. Sticking your head in the sand doesn't stop Black EITC taxpayers from being audited 3 to 5 times. The fact that the previous IRS commissioner said, I don't discriminate on the basis of race, that would be abhorrent. You okay? He says that in front of the cameras. When Senator Sherrod Brown said a follow-up question, you say you don't collect statistics on race. How can you therefore say you don't discriminate on the basis of race? Now the camera's not rolling, Commissioner, yeah, you're right. Like, really? Right, so, I'm optimistic with respect to where this conversation is going. I did a podcast recently, was asked to, as a professor, to give a grade to the Biden administration, to the Department of Treasury, and to the IRS. Okay, I gave the Biden administration a B+, which, for me, it's pretty good. Like, on this issue, I'm giving everybody F's, right? So to give the Biden administration a B+, it's like, ooh, Dorothy must be really happy. And first of all, it's the racial equity order that President Biden signed, one of his first executive orders when he, became president, which set in motion the fact that there's the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. Now, it took 2 years for it to happen. I'm not bitter or anything, but okay, that's why the B+. Okay, it took a minute, but they're actually trying, and I'm sorry, that's Biden. We'll get to Treasury next. So he gets a B+, and there was a follow-up executive order talking, and part of the first executive order was disaggregating data by race. which is really what you need for Treasury and IRS to get it together. So that's like really significant. And then the Biden administration did a follow-up executive order about AI and algorithms, right? Which is, prescient, because that's part of why black earned income tax credit claimants are being audited, because the IRS is running an algorithm that somehow manages to find black people. Just saying, right? This is the problem with AI, divorced from the humanities, right? So, they're basically saying we need to fix this. Treasury, my grade was incomplete, which I thought was generous. Because I'm going to give you an extension, as Janel knows, to turn in your work. Incomplete. I'm hoping for the best. I'm giving you an incomplete. See you next semester. And part of why I gave Treasury an incomplete is TACRE, as we affectionately call the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. Our job is to make recommendations, but we have to see which one of those the Treasury Secretary enforces. Because we can make a ton of recommendations, and if they don't apply any of them, they incomplete. It's going to turn into a different grade, right? So the jury's out. We're in the process of making recommendations, so we're going to see what's going to happen. The last grade I gave was to the IRS. They get an F. Because they still refuse to, if it wasn't for Senator Wyden demanding the report, the now commissioner said things like, well, no, we're really not going to get into race and things like that. So how you can say that when you know there's this study out there, and it's even worse. In 2019, ProPublica did a series of reports on the earned income tax credit and how if you were black or Hispanic, you were more likely to be, or Indigenous American, you were more likely to be audited than your white peers, when roughly half of EITC claimants are white. That's how systemic racism works. It operates on its own. You have to disrupt it, and before you can disrupt it, you have to know it exists. And if you're walking around saying, we're colorblind, we don't see color, then you're never gonna be able to disrupt it. So my goal was to change the conversation, and 30 years, I'm a slow worker, right? But I'm making progress, and I'm very excited about what we're going to see out of Treasury, which of the recommendations we make that are going to be accepted, and to continue the conversation. And I'll end it with how I got to the next book being reparations. When I finished The Whiteness of Wealth, and I thought about the role that tax policy played in the racial wealth gap, I realized there's only one thing that can fix this, and it's reparations. And I came to the project as a skeptic, the reparations project as a skeptic, just like I came to the race and tax project as a skeptic. But if we really want to be serious about equity and fairness, then we have to take into account that there are a group of people or groups of people who are disadvantaged from the system of building wealth. They started behind, and the behind just continues because, once slavery ended, we had sharecropping. Once that ended, we had FHA redlining. Once it hasn't stopped, and as we see, redlining, of course, the federal government doesn't do that, but the Justice Department recently signed a multi-million-dollar settlement with a bank on redlining. It's like it doesn't stop. So there are public actors, private actors that are all implicated, and it's going to take, as I put it, all hands on deck for this to work. And programs like this is really exciting for me to see. And people actually are interested in hearing what I have to say, which always shocks me. It's like, you want me to talk about race and tax? And again, I go back to tax policy as a civil rights issue. And it hasn't always been embraced that way. But after my book, and people started reading it, I just did an interview with NPR, with Code Switch. And Gene Denby said, I gotta tell you, Professor Brown, I got this book on tax, and I can't say I was that excited to open it, but it actually was a page turner. It's like the high praise I get on my teaching evals. This course was not as dull as I thought it would be. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Okay? So I get it. You hear taxes, but I tell you, the people who aren't running away are the people with the low tax rates, okay? Lots of money, low tax rates. So you gotta stay in it, even if you wanna go like this, you can't. So thank you so much for coming. I hope these words have been helpful in some way. And if there's time for Q&A, I'd be happy to take some questions. If not, if I'm standing between you and the bar.
I have a couple questions. I'll do them real quick. So the first one is on reparations, which is an incredible subject. I'm so glad you in particular are tackling it. The polls all say that people who oppose reparations is not because they're worried about the money that goes out, it's because they feel like people are getting a handout, which, as you just pointed out, is ridiculous after 400 years of this twisted system. So how do you address that in the book? That's question number one. Question number two, I have the great good fortune of having among my friends Brian Stevenson, who had, of course, a movie made about him. Michael B. Jordan played him. So when the movie was made about you, so who's going to play you?
That's hilarious. Okay, I'll take the first question first. So part of the reason why people frame this as a handout is they don't know the history. They don't know that there's been a hand in black pockets stripping us from wealth over hundreds of years. And I've commissioned some focus group testing on reparations. And what I found is when people are explained that history, they get it. And let me just say, the attack on history in schools there's a reason for it, and we just can't let it happen. Because without that history, then it's like, yeah, I don't understand what you're talking about. Well, did we have slavery? Because we could get to the point where we can't even talk about slavery in the classroom. So I think explaining how after slavery ended, it didn't end, is really important. Who do I want to play me in that? That's a great question.
Questions for you. Could you give us, as lawyers, one or two action items we can do to help you and your work or move this issue forward in the legal community, but also in the broader community?
So, I would say one of the things I talk about in my book, in chapter 6, I give a prescription, but I also talk about, black people need to be defensive players in a system designed to build white wealth, and white people need to be transparent about the privileges they have had in building their wealth. So one of the things you can talk to the audience about is which category does your audience fit into. So for example, if you're black and you're thinking about buying a home, be really conscious, know this, you have a choice. You could buy a home in a racially diverse or all black neighborhood, and there'll be a consequence, a financial consequence associated with that. I call it the appreciation gap. Your home will not appreciate as much if you're the only black person in an all white neighborhood. But if you're the only black person in an all white neighborhood, you got some other issues to deal with, which I call racism triage. Okay? Which fight am I gonna fight today? Okay? The neighbor who calls the cops on me, like Ving Rhames, who's a freaking actor, and his neighbor called the cops on him when he tried to get in his own home. Because, you don't see the man on the Mission Impossible. Really? Okay. Or you send your children to school, and they behave like their white peers, but they're targeted for discipline because they're, cutting up, right? So you have a choice. If you choose to live in a racially diverse or all black neighborhood, then I say don't be house poor, don't take out a home equity loan, make sure that whatever equity is in there remains in there. So I would say black people need to be smarter or better informed about making those kinds of decisions. And white people need to be more transparent about the home buying assistance they got, how their parents or grandparents paid for their kids' private K-12 school, or paid for college education, all those kinds of things. Because the white families in my book wouldn't let me use their last name, right? They only let me use their first name because they didn't want their families to be outed with respect to the privilege, which is really interesting.
And in your book, you address how this black taxpayers come out in tax controversy matters, say starting with, from dealing with, I guess, say the civil side all the way through tax litigation.
So, there's an article that Professor Jeremy Barra-Friend at GW Law School wrote about tax enforcement and the IRS, and people haven't previously looked at that, right? The audit study is starting to look at that, and in my book, I talk about there was a phase where people were taking a reparations tax credit. Okay, I don't have to tell you there's no such thing. But they were taking it on their taxes, and there was one father-daughter combination, and the father got many years in prison, as did the daughter, and when you asked the experts, they said they shouldn't have gotten like 6 months. So, whereas this other white couple in the state of Washington who filed an illegal return that the IRS said they shouldn't have, went to the Supreme Court and won. They're not in prison, they got a tax cut, right? So there is, when I think of enforcement, whether it's IRS or, it's the police, right? Let's talk about policing in America. I call the IRS the tax police. And the minute I call them the tax police, light bulbs go off. Ooh, yeah, there's a little driving while black going on, right? One of my friends, Stephen Dean, wrote an article called Filing While Black, right? There's this issue that we don't think about, but the minute you say the IRS is the tax police, it's like, oh, okay, so we might have a problem. Yes, you had.
I had a question and I just shoved a food into my face. That's
okay.
I'm also a Brown, but a different one.
Okay.
I'm Lydia Brown. I teach in disability studies at Georgetown, and I work at the National Disability Institute. And the bulk of my work addresses economic disparities impacting disabled people of color, whether they're from the Black community, Latina, Indigenous, or Asian communities. I guess there's two questions that I have. One is, are there, in your work now, do you have potential plans that could allow for more data collection and analysis of the marriage penalty as it affects disabled people of color in particular? And number two, just surely out of curiosity, are there any statistics about interracial married families, both where both spouses are people of color but from different racial groups, or between a white spouse and a spouse of color at the same time? And I'm also just thinking about this. I'm not choking on my food, I promise. I'm also thinking about this from my own perspective as someone whom, I'm an East Asian person, and my spouse is a white person, and our families had opposite trajectories, where their family, they grew up wealthy, and then their parents had downward social mobility for a variety of reasons. And my parents grew up working class, but I'm a survivor of transracial adoption. My parents are white. They had upward social mobility, not up to the upper class, but certainly to the bottom level of maybe the upper middle class and the very top of the middle class. So we had very different experiences. But now in our marriage, I have over the last several years worked at one time 7 simultaneous jobs to pay for all of our bills, support my spouse who has multiple disabilities, and another relative who also has multiple disabilities. And we are impacted by the tax penalty, and also just a very bizarre economic and tax situation that is not accounted for when most people are researching racial inequity in our tax policy or disability inequity. So I'd just love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, so it isn't any of the work I've done, and you're right, I can't think of a scholar off the top of my head, but I know when I was looking at Census Bureau data on marriage, I think the statistics were something like 90-something% of married couples were same-race couples. So my research focused on same-race couples. So
that makes sense,
right?
Yeah.
So, but part of what the Biden racial equity order talks about is disaggregating data on many different vectors, including disability. So, see, part of the problem is since the federal government has not taken this on, it's been reliant upon individual academics to decide to write in this area. So, that's a really good point. I don't know if anybody's writing in that space. But it's certainly data that should be collected under Biden's executive order.
I've told Treasury that.
Thank you. Thank you for making my job easier. Thank you. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. So my question, I guess, is two questions. The first is, how much of it is intentional in terms of reproducing racial inequality, or rather, how much of it is that society is already structured in a particular kind of way that knowingly reducing certain kind of tax policies is going to reproduce that inequality or perpetuate it? And then secondly, I think of Lee Atwater's famous phrase about pre-1968, we could talk about the N-word and right segregation, and then post-1968 you use taxes as you get interested abstract to sort of recreate
Tax cuts.
right? Tax cuts exactly to reproduce white supremacy. So one of the things I want to ask you is, what is the sort of distinction between pre-1968 and post-1968 in terms of tax policy to sort of reproduce white supremacy?
So, I leave it to the historians to look at the record to talk about the intentional piece. Because, something tells me if they look, they'll find it, right? Because people were saying a lot of stuff out loud back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right?
And again.
That's, we're in 2023.
Right.
But back then, they were really saying this stuff out loud. And I remember the Atwater quote, and he says, when he said, now we talk about tax cuts, and implicit in that statement is tax cuts are for white people, because white people are the only people who pay taxes. And I'm like, liar, liar, pants on fire. Black people are paying a whole lot of taxes that we're not even talking about, that we don't even care about, that we're not even conscious of. So, our tax system facilitates this building of white wealth, and it goes back into the foundation of our modern income tax system in 1913. In 1913, the only people who paid taxes were rich white people. Let me pause for a second. The only people who paid taxes were rich white people. And you know who didn't like it? Rich white people. So they basically spent the next few decades fixing it so that they weren't the only, and then World War II came along and we needed the revenue, and therefore it went from a class tax to a mass tax. But in the when only the rich people pay taxes, there was a tax break for gifts, inheritances. So it's like it was always about, even when we were taxing them, we weren't taxing them that much, because they could just transfer gifts and that's tax-free. So, our tax laws have always had white supremacy built into it because they've been enacted. I mean, I go back to 1913 and I go, which is where our modern income tax has its roots. But what was good for black people in 1913? Not much. Therefore, we know who it was designed to benefit, and it didn't matter when almost everybody was left out. When 1%, 5%, maybe 10% of the population paid it, it's like everybody else is left out. You can be white supremacist as hell. It doesn't matter because we're not taxing most people. When it became a class tax after World War II, and black people started paying taxes. Now let's think about this. Black people are paying taxes to fund World War II and an FHA administration that discriminates against them. Black people are paying taxes for a federal government that excludes the VA, the returning vets from getting benefits. Black people are paying taxes to support a government that is discriminating against them. So, let's talk about who's paying taxes. Let's talk about who this tax cut is. But I remember that Atwater quote, and I said, oh, this is really interesting because it plays into the myth that the only people who pay taxes are white. Black people are takers, and white people are the ones paying. And we got to get a tax cut because, black people think, no, we pay more taxes than you have any idea. And part of the problem of excluding this race and tax conversation is that goes sub rosa. And I think about, W.B. Du Bois wrote about this. Black schools were funded by black taxpayer dollars, but black taxpayer dollars went to fund white schools. White taxpayer dollars didn't go to fund black schools. So this notion that black people don't, not only do we pay taxes, we pay taxes for white schools, we can't join, so white people pay less taxes, right? So let's talk about who's getting the tax cut. So, it's been there from the beginning, and for the first time, we're starting to reveal all the ways that race is implicated in our tax system, from from filing income taxes as well as enforcement. And what I hope the next movement is looking at it in the business context, the corporate context, the partnership context. There's some work in the international tax context. So, I'm excited about people taking up the charge and it being far less hostile. Let me just say, the people who are like, Dorothy, I know you're talking about, oh, would you come and do a book tour? Would you come and present your book? I've always been a supporter. I'm like, no, you weren't. I remember. And no, I'm not coming to your place. So yeah. So, it's the hottest thing now. So people who never talked about race and tax, think tank, that never talked about race and tax, suddenly, ooh, let's talk about it. Dorothy, you have time for a phone call? It's like, really? But I think it's good, the more the merrier, because I'm like moving on to reparations. So y'all got this. I got another mission.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Michael Sanders from Results. I know you've talked about your role in the administration and working with the IRS, but do you have a message for Congress in terms of addressing racial inequality in the tax code?
Yeah, he is Senator Wyden. Always ask the question. Always pay attention to it. When I testified before the Senate Finance Committee, when I finished, and when Senator Wyden was giving his closing remarks, he said, this issue should not have been reliant on Professor Brown to take this on over 20-something years. And he has been steadfast and forthright on making sure that there's more race and tax data that we have access to. And my message to Congress is, hold on till you get more numbers, right? That's my message to Congress, because right now, and I think there's some room. The Trump tax cuts are expiring in 2025. I think we can make a deal. And if you were to ask me what deal should they make, I would say extending, fully funding the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Because one of the things we saw during the pandemic is it worked. People were able to sleep at night. They were able to provide for their families. They were able to take a breath. And that was so important. We can talk about the child poverty that was cut. I mean, it was an amazing program. We saw it work, and it died, right? So to me, there's room for a deal if folks want to make it. Thank you.